Welcome to Dale Borglum's Healing at the Edge. We are very happy to share with you Dale's profound insight and open heart. Please go to BeHereNowNetwork.com/Dale to support this podcast.
Welcome, everybody. This is Ramdev, Dale Borglum, at the Healing at the Edge podcast channel of the Be Here Now podcast network. That's always a mouthful, isn't it? And all the podcasts on this network are supported by your donations. So if you go to the main page and you'd like to donate, we would really appreciate that. Getting on now to what we'd really like to talk about is today I'm so happy to be here with my old friend, John Fox. John is the founder and executive director of the Institute for Poetic Medicine, which is an organization that uses the writing of poetry as a healing modality. And John, as well as other people in his institute, have brought these programs to refugees, victims of domestic abuse and sexual violence, people living with addiction, children, prisoners and their families, people with mental illness, and I'm sure there are other subpopulations of people that you have brought your wonderful workshops to. So John, welcome. Great to be with you today.
Thanks, Dale. How are you this morning?
Well, I'm good. It's the day after my birthday. It's 2 days after the eclipse, and people ask me that question, how am I? I never know quite what to say. You know,
Yeah.
I honestly feel like I'm a sandwich. And maybe I can explain that. So that on the top level of the sandwich, I'm cool. You know, I can keep it together. I've been doing this for a long time. I can be most of the time articulate and charming. And on the bottom of the sandwich is this unshakable faith in God. I know it's all okay. Money, relationships, illness, power, all those things that people worry about. I know that God's got my back. There's a quote I put on the bottom of some of my emails by Rumi where he says, live your life as if it were rigged in your favor. And there's another one I was just looking at from Wendell Berry who says, be joyful even though you've considered all of the facts. So there's this sandwich, like kind of chilled out on the top, complete faith on the bottom, and neurotic in the middle. Right? And so sometimes, like when you say, how am I? All three of those levels are at play, back and forth, right? You know, so today there's guys in the house cleaning the carpet and all these different things are going on. And, you know, that's fine. But sometimes things throw me off. I'm spending all day on the phone. I had to talk to the IRS today, you know, and yesterday they put me on hold for a really long time. And then at the end, they say, I'm sorry, the office is closed now. It's like, or I start yelling at the machine. Okay, enough about it.
One time I got audited by the IRS, and you know, and she, you know, the lady turned over every little receipt, you know, and every little receipt for like 3 days, and then at the end, she says, "Well, it turns out that we actually owe you money." but this has been such a process that we're not going to give it to you because we've gone through this whole process. So it can't. Sometimes you just can't win, you know.
But anyway, enough about me. Let's start talking about the Institute for Poetic Medicine and you. Let's find out what you do. I'm sure people here who are listening would like to know more about using poetry as healing and maybe some stories of people who have been transformed by writing poetry and how people can get involved with the Institute for Poetic Medicine.
Yeah. So, you know, it begins with my own story. Back in like 1974, my right leg was amputated below the knee. And I had already been sort of doing a deep dive into poetry since I was a junior in high school. And I loved Ramdev. I loved making things. I loved using words to make things. And so I was already in love with language, in love with words that way, and that I didn't mind sort of grappling with them on the page, even though, I was only 14. I mean, what? But then with this amputation of my leg, I realized that poetry had become a kind of lifeline. And even though I had gone off to study English and creative writing and wanted to get a degree in that, it's like that. And I completed that, but it lost interest for me. And it wasn't the only thing that did it, but part of that amputation threw me into this just an absolute desperate longing for God, for needing to know that I wasn't sort of cast out, that I wasn't cast out. And so people began to come into my life because I went towards them, such as Ram Dass. And I remember standing on a corner in Boston, because I was at Boston University, with Ram Dass and Beacon Street and Commonwealth Avenue. And I was really distraught. I mean, distraught doesn't even capture quite what I was feeling. And I was on crutches because it turned out that I couldn't, for about a period of 3 months, I couldn't wear my prosthetic leg, which also freaked me out, that I had to be out there in public without it. But I remember standing on the corner with Ram Dass and him looking at me, and it wasn't all sweetness and light at all. He looked at me and he said, in this sort of fierce voice, he said, "You couldn't get away if you tried." I know.
That sounds like him, all right.
It sounds funny, but it was like, I'm standing there thinking, what the, and it was like you couldn't get away from the suffering if you tried. If what I heard then, and later, it was only later that I felt that he was also telling me that I could not be, that God would not abandon me,
right.
that is impossible. And in any case, whichever I heard at that moment, I could also tell that he meant it, and that I was so grateful for somebody who said what they meant, and that I kept on. I kept writing, and then eventually, and this is another place where our paths connect. Is, let's see, like 6 years later, about 1981, I had moved to California, and from where I grew up in Ohio, and I came into deep contact with Stephen and Andrea
Levine.
Stephen Levine and his wife Andrea, and we had a wonderful connection, rapport, and eventually, and God knows why he ever did this, but Stephen asked me to manage some of his retreats. And so as I did that, he would invite me to read poetry at some of the longer retreats, and like at the Angelus Center in Santa Rosa. And so at one of those retreats, I must have read some poems, perhaps I said something about them in relationship to my life, and this orthopedic surgeon, a man named Ken Zubrick, came up to me, and sort of poetic justice, really, that it was an orthopedic surgeon, because that's who I had grown up with. This orthopedic surgeon came, "There's a woman you should meet who talks about poetry and healing just like you do." And I don't think anybody had ever mirrored that back to me, that that's what I was doing, or what he thought I was doing. So he introduced me to a woman named Joy Sheeman, who was a poetry therapist working at El Camino Hospital in Mountain View, California.
That's the hospital my father died in.
Oh my goodness, there, just on Grant Road. And so this is about 1984 or 83. So I was about to move from a spiritual community I lived in outside Nevada City to the Bay Area, to the South Bay. And so what began to feel like a real calling began perhaps then. And I contacted Joy, and then she invited me to work with her. So for 2.5 years, I worked at El Camino Hospital on the mental health wing, learning from her about this practice or field of poetry therapy. And things have just sort of, well, they've really flourished since that time in various ways.
So could you explain to me the difference between writing poetry and poetry therapy?
Well, that's assuming that there is a difference.
Well, she taught you something for a few years. I mean, I thought in my naivete that you had these workshops and these retreats and things, and people just came and wrote poetry, and in writing that they got more in touch with their feelings and healing happened.
Well, that's all true. And
so what did she teach you for 2 years then?
I believe she taught me how to listen. Like I began to listen. I think I could listen before, but I really, when I began this work at One South with Joy, and I knew there was lots to learn about poems, about how to, bring them to people, how to suggest writing prompts. But I asked myself, I said, what am I here to learn? What do I really, really need to learn if I'm going to do this? And this poem came on its own, pretty whole. I just say it to you now.
Sure.
So it's called When Someone Deeply Listens to You. When someone deeply listens to you, it's like holding out the dented cup you've had since childhood and watching it fill up with cold, fresh water. When it balances on top of the brim, you are understood. When it overflows and touches your skin, you are loved. When someone deeply listens to you, the room where you stay starts a new life, and the place where you wrote your first poem begins to glow in your mind's eye. It is as if gold has been discovered. When someone deeply listens to you, your bare feet are on the earth, and a beloved land that seemed distant is now at home within you. When someone deeply listens to you, your bare feet are on the earth, and a beloved land that seemed distant is now at home within you.
Beautiful. So suppose somebody's listening to this podcast.
Yeah.
And they feel that there's some imbalance in their life, or they'd like their spiritual practice to go deeper, or their relationship to be less problematic, or their relationship with themselves. And they have some intuition or maybe some inspiration from hearing you just read that poem, that they would like to start writing poetry as a way as part of their healing journey. What advice would you give them? How would they proceed, other than buying a pencil and a blank book?
Well, actually, that's what I would say. Get a good sharp pencil or a pen you like, and a notebook, a blank book, and just keep that nearby. Put it by your bedside. Write down a thought. You don't have to think of one doesn't have to think of some poetic thought. One can just begin. There's like there's a poem. It goes, "Do not wipe your tears away. Let them flow down your cheek. Let them create a stream on your face to allow the healing waters to flow. Let them." And so I could just to people listening right now at this moment, take that first line that says, "Do not wipe your tears." Make it, "Do not wipe my tears away." dot, dot, dot. And then there's the phrase, let them, let them, let them. So include that. Make a poem using those two phrases. The beginning phrase, prompt line, do not wipe my tears away. And then just the two words, let them. And right from there. You asked what is the difference? So here, we're not trying to write that we're going to publish a poem in, a magazine or have it judged by judges. But instead, we're going to do this for ourselves. We're going to begin to trust our own. And some people listening to this have certainly already been writing. But if you haven't, this is a way of beginning to just trust your own sort of self and let it unfold. So write that down and then find a friend who you feel would you just say, I just like you to listen. I don't need you to make any kind of, interpretation or comment. Would you just like a poem about listening? Would you just listen to me and, see if you can find a fairly quiet place and just read them, share that poem with them, and then see how that feels in your heart.
Thank you. That sounds easy enough, and at the same time deeply challenging.
What's the challenging part? What's for you?
Well, I laugh because so many years ago, when was it? I mean, it was like back in the 1980s. I was teaching a workshop with my friend Wayne Muller, who has written any number of books. He's a beautiful guy, and he had a book editor. He had a literary agent who I met, and she said at that point, 30 years ago, that I've never met somebody who had such a good book in them that hadn't written a book. And that was 30 years ago. I still haven't written the book. So, every year I'm writing newsletters and I write stuff, but it always feels to me like squeezing blood out of a rock because I'm writing stuff to be published.
Right.
And I have and I'm writing nonfiction, and I kind of feel like a perfectionist and a poet. So I like the sentences that have a certain feel to them and a certain flow. And I mean, writing's hard work.
Well,
for me.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and the kind of writing you're describing. I mean, I've written a couple of books, and it's been hard work. And sometimes it's been really joyful. But then here's, so part of what I would do in my work, if I was working with you, Ramdev, is like how to encourage that. There's a little poem by a wonderful poet, Charles Olson, and it's very short. It's like 22 words. It goes like this. Whatever you have to say, leave the roots on. Let them dangle. And the dirt. Just to make clear where they come from. Whatever you have to say, leave the roots on. Let them dangle. And the dirt. Just to make clear where they come from. That's it.
Right.
So
I get that, but I'm writing this newsletter article that is in this our annual newsletter, which is our only fundraising appeal of the year, right?
Right.
So I'm trying to. I've got this little pin I can put on my shirt. It says "cleverly disguised as a responsible adult."
So what does that mean to you? I know you've got to write the newsletter, but what is it? So I'll ask people. I say, okay, what does it mean for you if you heard this line to leave the roots on and the dirt? What is that?
What does that mean to me?
What does it feel like to you? Mean and feel and what.
So what it feels like to me is there's a quality of being feral, but kind of being wild and untamed, and something that's just growing and is untamed in a certain way, and that you just let the words pour out, and there's a certain earthiness about them.
Yeah,
And that maybe later you go back in and clean it up a little bit so you're not getting dirt all over the carpet of the homes
Okay.
or the people that it's going to, but that you just let that dirt come out.
So what I might suggest is say, I just let that dirt come out, you know?
Okay.
But okay, so you used a word. I just wanted you to know this. You know, on some things I have a good memory. And I've shared that poem with thousands of people for decades. And nobody, I'm sure of this, nobody has, in response to it, has ever used the word feral.
Uh-huh.
It's so take that in. I mean, it's like I'm just saying that, you know, your sort of gut or heart or whatever it is feeling to that, it allows for a certain feralness. And so you might write a poem that you title Feral, and then just go from there.
Okay.
And don't worry about your newsletter. It's not going to go ahead.
It's gotten way easier as the years have gone on. My friend Andy Lamott, who's one of the podcasts on this channel,
Yeah.
she's got 2 instructions for writing.
Okay.
Write shitty drafts, write small assignments.
Okay, so here, and of course, you know, Annie Mott is, you know, a brilliant and a master, but here's a difference I can point out between poetry and healing. And, you know, I think what she's talking about, like write shitty drafts. Yes, but we're not thinking about publication. I'm thinking about, like, if I have just lost someone who is absolutely beloved to me, and I cannot see how I can go on. I don't care about. I need to get something down on that paper because my immune system, my soul's immune system, needs to say something if I can allow it. So do you hear me? Do you hear me? That I'm not, like, the idea that I don't even want people to think about. Is this a shitty draft or is it not a shitty draft? It's like it's my words. Here's a story that I think is important. So I was with a group of people in their 90s at an assisted living place, and many of the people had dementia or sort of special forgetfulness, and I was reading poems to them, and we were just. I have to tell you that they were the most delighted group I've ever worked with. They were so happy, and they were so pleased just to hear these poems. However, there was one woman who was 86, and she was young, so she was younger, and she was a little more sort of what's the word? Not skeptical, but she was thinking. And so there was one moment where I had a big dry erase board, and I was going to have people speak a poem about gardens, and just a line, any line you want to say, we'll write it down. So I moved towards doing that, and this lady, Martha, I could just feel her body language sort of shut down, and she wasn't going to write. She did not say, I don't want to write, but I could just feel her withdraw. So because I was just enjoying this experience of sharing, I just let it go. So I let it go, and then maybe 10 minutes later or so, I thought, well, maybe she's ready now. So I came back, and once again, and there was nothing spoken about, I don't want to write, but I could tell she didn't want to, so I let it go. Then we were coming to the end of the group, and I was saying, I've enjoyed being with you so much. And this woman, Martha, leaned forward with her elbows on her knees, and her, you know, like this. And she said, you know, I wanted to tell you why I didn't want to write. So that's the first time it had been spoken, but here she was speaking it out loud. And she said, when I was in 3rd grade, so if she's 86, that's like 78 years ago. When I was in 3rd grade, our teacher had given us an assignment to bring a poem in and recite it to the class. And so at that point, this is kind of a long story, but it's worthwhile. So she stood up with her walker, and, you know, she was balanced on her walker. Her shoulders were straight. She had a real posture. And so then she said this poem, and it wasn't a haiku. It was a fairly, you know, medium-sized poem that she knew by heart. that she had memorized for her third grade class. And the teacher, she said, the teacher had told her that her poem, she didn't do the assignment correctly and her poem wouldn't be accepted with the other children's poems. So it may be hard to believe, but for like a long time, 78 years, she had carried that injury about her creative voice around with her. And here she was able to share it with me and share it with people who were her peers. And so the reason I'm sharing this story is I feel that we think we have to, be right and proper and perfect, but I often feel that something has happened in childhood that has sort of taken away from us this birthright of being able to be creative and use our own voice, use your own words in whatever way, whatever feral way you would like to experiment with. And so a lot of the work that I do, getting back to this work, is to make it safe for people to take a risk. Sort of this very sort of close idea of both risk and safety, and have them kind of overlap. So I don't know if that speaks to what we're talking about, Ramdev, but
of course it does.
But I feel that sense of, that adults can think up all kinds of ways to cut themselves off from, and thinking I have to make it so other people will approve of it is certainly one of them.
Could you tell us the address of your website and maybe mention those 2 books that you've written?
Sure. So the first book, I was part of that unfolding I was talking about. And, a mutual friend of ours is Jim Fadiman.
Right.
And, Jim helped to found the Institute for Transpersonal Psychology and currently is doing a lot of work around microdosing. But about 28 years ago, I had been hired to teach a class in poetry therapy at John F. Kennedy University in the Graduate School of Psychology. So I put together a course reader for that about poetry therapy, with like 300 pages of articles and stuff about using poetry as healing. And I thought, well, I've never done this before. I better take it to somebody who knows what they're doing. So I took this course reader to Jim Fadiman. I remember standing on the apron of his driveway on Colby in Menlo Park, and he was looking through this book, this course reader. He said, "You should make a copy of this and send it to Jeremy Tarcher." And
that's the way to write a book. You've got it there already.
Well, but that's not what the book became. But and then sort of this synchronicity of things. What Jim didn't know is 8 years prior to that, I had sent poems out to publishers, and one of them was Jeremy Tarcher, even though they didn't publish poetry, and I had no idea that he would be even been interested. But so that 8 months prior to that moment at Jim's driveway, I sent these poems to Jeremy Tarcher. He called me on the phone 5 days later, and he said, we don't publish poetry, and poetry doesn't sell, but I'm about to go on vacation, and I'm going to take your poems with me.
Well, so far you still haven't told us the name of the books.
I know. So anyway, this is just a little sort of story that they don't help them by magic. So Jim sent a recommendation letter, and then Jeremy said, "I'm interested in talking to you." So the first book I wrote is called "Finding What You Didn't Lose," and it's based on what we were just talking about. That my sense that we come in as children with creativity, with our own voice. And when I wrote to Jeremy about my idea, I included a little quatrain by E.E. Cummings. It goes, "The trick of finding what you didn't lose. Existing's tricky, but to live's a gift. The teachable imposture of always, arriving at that place you never left." So when I wrote to Jeremy saying what my idea was, I said, describes it. He wrote back, said, "Let's call the book Finding What You Didn't Lose. Expressing your truth and creativity through poem making." So That was 1995, and then 1997, he wanted me to do a second one. So that second book is called Poetic Medicine, The Healing Art of Poem Making. Poetic Medicine, The Healing Art of Poem Making.
Okay. And what about your website?
The website is just poeticmedicine.org.
Okay.
You know, www.poeticmedicine.org. And something that's a little more like alive and breathing. I mean, the website is certainly worth going to, but if you do the Institute for Poetic Medicine Facebook, there's a lot of juicy things on that website. And I want to thank Claire Densmore for helping to keep that so alive.
Okay. Maybe I'll put in a plug for the Living Dying Project website, which as of yesterday was updated. We have a great new homepage and everything. livingdying.org. And if this is not too difficult, I remember some years ago, I'm on your mailing list, of course. And in fact, I should mention to people that I really encourage you to get on John's mailing list, because he sends out a newsletter at least a couple times a year through email. And you had such a moving poem by your sister, who I believe had Down syndrome, and I believed did she die then eventually?
Holly died in May of 2013.
Do you have that poem that I'm thinking of? Convenient?
I have a couple of poems. I don't think I have a poem by Holly right in front of me. And then there was a poem I wrote for my other sister who's also died.
No, there was something that Holly wrote, or you wrote for Holly, that was in one of the newsletters. That's just, I found so moving. I should have asked you about this before we started, but that's okay if it's not around. Let me just say, though, that there's just a lot of beautiful stuff in John's newsletter.
And something that's important to say, Ramdev, is that, and I haven't spoken about this, but there's me and what I've done, but the Institute funds projects across the country. When you name those different groups that we bring poetry to, veterans, to people dealing with addiction, to women who have suffered, or anybody who suffered domestic abuse, working with people with traumatic brain injury, working with refugees and immigrants. All that work is being done by our poetry partners around the country, people doing brilliant work. Myrna Ann Hecht, working with refugees and immigrants for 8 years up in Tukwila, which is just south of Seattle. You could check out a wonderful book that got published of their work called Our Table of Memories. Our Table of Memories. She works with a particular class at a high school, and there's like 13 countries represented in that one high school class.
Wow.
And so I'm really proud of the work we do with bringing poetry and giving people a voice, who are often marginalized, so-called marginalized by this culture, but whose voices are really the ones we most need to hear. I do have.
Before we bring it to a close, do you have a poem or two that you'd like to read?
Yeah, let's see. So this is a grief poem. This is a poem that I wrote after my sister Holly died. For a year. It was, I could just start thinking about her. I just start crying. It was just how it was. I mean, wish we had a way to show her picture. But I wrote a poem called Days of Rain. Days of rain. Open me up to feel due words. Philip Booth. I want the losing it all, as when it rains hard. I want letting it all loose, to open myself to the only true opener of my freer, falling feeling. I want that dense drape of drenched space to drop into the entire air, the atmosphere, the ache, fall there, drawn down, drowned into the lowest ground of the great and good grieving, soaked into that low place of kind green grass, and further then into the darker grit that gathers it, the one who finally gets it, who becomes exactly what it is, the one who lets the grieving sound out again, yet now wholly held, returns it to the singular heart of mine that might, may, must grow greater through love's loss. And further then into the darker grit that gathers it, the one who finally gets it, who becomes exactly what it is. Like not someone who tries to fix me, not someone who tries to make it better.
Right.
The one who becomes exactly what it is. The one who lets the grieving sound out again, yet now wholly held, returns it to the singular heart of mine that might, may, must grow greater through love's loss. It's called Days of Rain.
Thank you. So John and I have been having a conversation. I don't know if it's how clear it is, but John and I see each other, are in each other's presence very seldom. But for some reason, there's always been a deep, deep love between us. As I mentioned, he wrote to the Hanuman Foundation back in 1974, and I wrote back. He asked some question about service, and somehow we connected. We bump into each other out at Commonweal sometimes when they're having a cancer symposium or something, a healing symposium, or maybe we'll meet at the Fadiman's anniversary party coming up, whatever, we'll see. But
that'd be sweet.
I've always really appreciated you in my life here. Sorry for the noise. And I remember once you sent me an email. I don't know even what it was about, but at the end you said, "I'm glad to be close to you." And I've always remembered that phrase. And to be honest with you, to confess, I've used it a few times myself.
Steal. Well, great poets. You're concerned about, they steal. They don't.
Well, I don't know if you can copyright just that one phrase or anything, but it's just it so succinctly puts something that people kind of beat around the bush about again and again, and you just like put it right out there. I'm glad to be close to you, and that really encompasses so many different kinds of feelings. Yeah. So thank you for that. Thank you for this time together. I'll invite you to say anything else you'd like, if anything at all, to bring this to a close, or we can let it be what it is right now.
Well, let it be. So thank you. At that time when I was in travail and Ramdas said you couldn't get away if you tried, how right he was,
when you said that, the immediate thought to me that what he was meaning was that you can't get away from God, that you might think that you're separated. You might think you've got so many problems that...
Not just separated, Ramdev, but completely thrown into outer darkness, on purpose.
No, but you can't get away from God. I think Maharaj even had a line once where he said something, you might forget me, but I'm never going to forget you.
Right.
Once I've got you, I'm never going to let go.
Right. Well, I do think that's what he meant, and I think that the other meaning was also helpful to me.
Yeah.
That I had to live with what I was living with.
Yeah.
And nothing was going to change that. So that actually proved to be quite fierce. I heard it fiercely. I didn't hear it at that time. It proved to be an important way of being able to stay, so I could stay with myself. Hopefully I'll continue to feel that way. Here's a poem. This is called When Jewels Sing. So those radiance results from Earth's pressure, life working on us with each moment's precision into a clear-cut uniqueness. A community of precious human beings with origins primitive and wild as diamonds, faceted by skilled and invisible hands that turn us upon a wheel dusted with God's bright, dark silence. We become men and women joined to walk swarthy, holy, original, transparent, catching first light of day upon ourselves, our voices sing of truth and loveliness in response to vows first sung to us by stars. Catching first light of day upon ourselves, our voices sing of truth and loveliness in response to vows first sung to us by stars.
Written by John Fox.
That's what they say.
Or somebody
No,
that was using your hand.
Yeah, no, somebody was using my hand. Yeah.
Thank you so much, John.
Oh, thank
I
you.
touch your feet. I touch your heart. I appreciate our friendship. I'm so glad to be close to you.
Likewise. And Jai Hanuman.
Jai Hanuman.